Ms. King here, and in this screencast, we're going to look at functional groups. So we're going to be looking at some chemistry, some molecules and compounds, and in biology, some of the more important elements that we're going to see in a lot of those compounds are carbon. Carbon's the most important of the six. We'll see a lot of hydrogen and oxygen. Some of our molecules will also contain nitrogen and phosphorus and sulfur as well. So why is carbon so special? And the reason is because it has 4 valence electrons. So here's the ring structure for carbon. In the middle we'll have our 6 protons. The atomic number for carbon is 6. So that means that it will have 2 electrons in the first shell and 4 electrons in this outer shell. And these 4 electrons in the outer shell, those are the valence electrons. So those electrons can be used to form chemical bonds with other elements. The second shell in an atom should have 8 electrons. So carbon has exactly half the number of electrons in that outer shell. That gives it the ability to make single, double, and triple bonds. A single bond is when we're sharing 1 pair of electrons. A double bond is when it's sharing 2 pairs of electrons. And then a triple bond is going to share 3 pairs of electrons. So carbon, because it has these 4 valence electrons, can make different types of bonds with other elements. Because of that ability, carbon's able to form what we call straight chains. And that's when we just have a bunch of carbons lined up in a straight line bonded together, kind of like this one right here. Carbon can also form ring structures. So we can take those carbons and connect them together in this circular pattern to form a ring. Or they can also form branched chains. So if we have that straight chain of carbons that we see right here, well, we can take other carbons and branch off of our straight chain. So that's what we get a branched chain. Now when we look at different carbon molecules, for example this one, you can see the letters written out. So these are carbons, and then the H's are hydrogens, and each one of those lines represents a bond. One line is a single bond. If there were 2 lines, it would be a double bond, and 3 lines would be a triple bond. And what we have here is the exact same molecule, just written in a different way. This is more of a shorthand way of writing a long carbon chain. So what we would do is there's actually a carbon at each one of those points on that chain, kind of like that. So here we have a 6 carbon molecule, and then if you count 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, it's exactly the same molecule. And we're just going to assume or imply that that carbon has 3 hydrogens, and that this carbon has 2 hydrogens, and so on. So this is just a shorthand way of writing this very same molecule. So you could see it either way when we practice some examples in class. Alright, so when we're looking at hydrocarbons, one of the things we need to pay attention to is prefixes. They can tell us a lot about a molecule. So anytime we have a hydrocarbon molecule that starts with the prefix meth, that means it's a 1 carbon molecule. Eth is a 2 carbon molecule. Prop is a 3 carbon molecule, and so forth. So we can use these prefixes to determine the structure of a carbon molecule. We can also look at the suffixes to determine what types of bonds our molecule is going to have. So a hydrocarbon that ends with ane, A-N-E, means that there's all single bonds. A hydrocarbon that ends with the suffix ene, E-N-E, tells us that there's at least one double bond somewhere in our molecule. And the suffix "-ine", Y-N-E, tells us that there's at least one triple bond somewhere in our hydrocarbon molecule. So if we practice a couple of those, some examples, a one carbon compound, so there's one carbon, has all single bonds, would be named methane. Meth for one carbon, ane for all single bonds. A three carbon compound with all single bonds would be called propane. Prop for three and ane for all single bonds. And a three carbon compound with double bonds would be called propene. Prop for three carbons and ene for double bonds. And we will practice some of those in class. All right, so the next thing that we need to look at is our functional groups. And the functional groups are groups of atoms that are going to participate in chemical reactions. So whenever two molecules or compounds are joined together or broken apart, it's usually going to be in an area where we find one of these functional groups. The first functional group is called the methyl group. Its general formula is CH4. And one example is methane. And this is what a methyl group looks like. There's one carbon, meth means one, and then the H's are bonded to that carbon. And we find methane in oil, natural gas, coal, even gas from livestock or landfills, that kind of thing. The next functional group is a hydroxyl alcohol. We use the formula OH for alcohols, so anytime you see an OH in a molecule, that means it's a type of alcohol. Ethanol and isopropyl alcohol are some of the most common examples. And here's one of those. This is ethanol right here. There's two carbons, and then here is our OH. And we find a lot of alcohols in sugars, sugar molecules. All right, the next functional group is called a carbonyl aldehyde. An aldehyde is going to be in the general formula of carbon, and there's a single bonded hydrogen and a double bonded hydrogen, or oxygen, excuse me. So we would use the letter COH to show that there is a double bonded oxygen and a single bonded hydrogen. One example is propanol. Propanol has three carbons, but this group here on the end is our aldehyde. Here's the carbon with the double bonded oxygen and the single bonded hydrogen. And we find this in also with sugars and formaldehyde. That's the stuff that you've probably heard goes in dead people, formaldehyde, for preservative. All right, the next functional group is called a carbonyl ketone, and we use the formula C, carbon, with a double bonded oxygen. There is something that you need to make a note of, and that ketones are always going to have to be in the middle of the molecule. It's never going to be at the end. When we practice some examples, you'll understand a little bit better about why we can't have a ketone at the end of a molecule. So acetone is a common ketone. Ladies, this is the substance that you have in your fingernail polish remover. But there's three carbons, and in this middle carbon is our double bonded oxygen. And again, we find ketones in sugars, and we also find it in urine from breaking down fat. All right, the next functional group is called a carbonyl ester. We use the formula carbon with a single bonded oxygen and a double bonded oxygen. Polyester is a common ester that you may have heard of before. This is one of the fabrics that you might have in your clothing. And you can see right here in the middle of this molecule, we have a double bonded oxygen to our carbon and then a single bonded oxygen. So this would be our ester. And again, polyesters are found in fabrics and specifically some fats and oils in the living organisms. Okay, the next functional group is carbonyl ether, and we represent an ether group with just an oxygen in the middle of two things. Dimethyl ether is an example. So you can see right here we have two carbons and there is a single oxygen in the middle of them. So this would be our ether group. We find these a lot in sugars and some of those hydrocarbon fuels like natural gas and coal. All right, another functional group we have is a carboxyl called a carboxylic acid. And we use COOH for carboxylic acid. That's a carbon with a double bonded oxygen and a single bonded OH. An example is acetic acid, which you might know as vinegar. Here's the two carbons, and then this carbon has the double bonded oxygen and the single bonded OH. Be real careful. Here's another one of those that you'll have to be careful not to mix up with. This is not an alcohol by itself. This OH is attached to a carbon with a double bonded oxygen, so the whole thing stays together as one carboxylic acid. Okay, so be careful not when we're doing practice examples not to circle this and call it a ketone and then circle this and call it an alcohol, because they're both attached to the same carbon. They have to go together, and that would make that a carboxylic acid. And again, we find these a lot in proteins or amino acids, which are the building blocks for proteins, and some of your vitamins as well. The next functional group is called an amino or an amine. And this is usually represented with a nitrogen. Nitrogen can bond 3 times, so it will be connected to 3 other elements, excuse me. Methylamine is a example. So here we have our nitrogen right here in the middle, and it has 2 hydrogens connected to our carbon. So this would be our amino group. And again, we find those in amino acids or proteins. We find those in urine from breaking down those proteins. All right, and our last functional group is called the phosphate group. PO4 is our formula. It might look something kind of like this, a P in the middle with 4 oxygens surrounding it. An example that we're actually going to learn later on in the year is adenosine triphosphate, or ATP. And this is what that molecule looks like. Here's our 3 phosphates attached to our molecule. So these would be our phosphate functional groups. Okay, and we find these a lot in cell membranes. Again, ATP, that's a form of energy in living things. And also in nucleic acids, we'll see phosphates when we do DNA. And those are your functional groups. We'll practice some of those in class, so be sure to bring any questions that you have about identifying the functional groups in a compound.